We don't live in a perfect world, but in the pursuit, we should still try to remove that which is wrong and keep that which is right. And so we can at least agree on these issues that are harder maybe to define, that it shouldn't be exposed to minors, and thus there should be extra protections. Good morning, Idaho. Welcome to the Local Yokel Idaho podcast, where we talk about what is going on in the wonderful state of Idaho. For those tuning in for the first time, we like to have a little banter before we get into the stories. I understand if you're short on time, so we've provided timestamps in the description so you can straight to the stories that you're interested in. For all those that stayed, welcome. Glad to have you here with us today. Hopefully you all had a wonderful week. I know I sure did with the amazing weather in the valley that we've been having. It's given me a bit of a spring fever. And for those up north, I quickly searched this before writing the script. It looks like you guys also got up to 50, so that must feel pretty nice when you're used to the colder temperatures and all the snow you've been getting, which we will get actually into some stuff related to the weather in our last story, kind of some outdoor activities, because that spring fever caught me and I decided to write a little bit of a segment on that for you guys for some helpful places. But so I don't leave John out of the fun, he is the editor for the show and will be co-hosting with me again today.
Yeah, Tyler, I am here and I'm glad to be here. It's been kind of a crazy week, but I'm excited to go over some of these stories.
Nice. I'm always glad to have you here. I know I've had a couple people in person that have mentioned they very much enjoy having your wonderful voice on the show.
Well, good. I'm glad I can be here.
But I know you've been very busy this week. People can tell by the amount of short content we have not put out.
Yeah, the lack of content that I created.
Hopefully that meant maybe in a small amount of that you're able to get out or at least go for a walk or something.
Not really. I've been busy with engineering work and I've been busy with sick children and I was dealing with some sickness and yeah, it's been a bunch of other things that have taken up a lot of my time. So I
can relate with the sickness part. I was worried a little bit that I wasn't going to be able to record because I think it was like Wednesday. I went out with some friends and we had some barbecue. And if any of you experienced that, if you don't drink enough water after eating barbecue, it can have some rather drying effects in the throat.
That's true.
And the next day I woke up and I was like, oh, please just be the barbecue. Just be the barbecue. Cause I don't want to be sick. It's Wednesday. If I'm sick Wednesday, I'm not gonna be able to talk on Friday. This is not going to work.
Yeah.
But it was the barbecue. Praise the Lord. It's a good problem to have.
That's good. That's good. That's an easy solution to a potentially problematic problem.
Right. But hopefully not too many of your kids have been down sick because I know it's been moving through the valley.
Well, one of them was throwing up and then the others were, I don't know, congested and snotty and sleep wasn't happening well. And I'm trying to think, I know baseball season is starting this spring. So I guess that is the one place that I was at. My oldest does Little League baseball. And so we were at the first practice of the season. And so I was outside at that point. And it was nice, but it was windy and a little chilly.
Maybe that was like
my
Tuesday.
Goodness, it got cold.
I know earlier in the week it was a little cold, but the latter half of this week has been really nice.
It was on Wednesday that we were out at the field, and it was chilly.
Right.
So I know the kids were every once in a while they throw a ball and it would just like sail off in the middle of nowhere and be like, oh, your fingers are cold. You couldn't hold on to the ball or follow through or release at all.
That's when you're like, you just need to move more, be more active. I mean, it's the one nice benefit when it's cold outside and you're doing active events. I've always been, there's a fine line of where it's too cold. I will give you that. But it is kind of nice sometimes to have it a little cooler when you're doing outside activities.
Yeah, no, I know when I was in high school, I played basketball and I was in Michigan. So it was always cold during basketball season. And we played at two different gyms and the one gym was always really, really hot. And the other gym was always cold. And so it was always the question of, well, do I want the gym to be cold where the moment I stop moving, all of my sweat freezes? Or do I want to play at the hot gym where I'm just hot and overheating the whole time? And it was like the worst of both worlds.
You're like, which one do I choose? Which shall I condemn myself to?
Yeah, and neither were good.
Well, speaking of the nice weather, one thing I did get the chance to thankfully do between writing and doing different stuff for the show is I drove up, I think it was Wednesday? Yeah, Wednesday with some friends and stuff. They said they had a spare day off, and we drove up to Ola through, so you go Emmett, Sweet, and then Ola. I had been through Sweet a couple times. There's a certain member of the church that me and John go to. He lives up there, and I'd been that way, but I hadn't actually been all the way up to Ola. So we decided to take that drive because I heard it would have been rather pretty, and it was. It did not disappoint. Sadly, though, the conversation in the car was too good, and so I didn't pull over and take any footage. Because I was like, oh, this is just great. I'm driving, I'm talking, and then I only kicked myself once we got back in Emmett, and I was like, oh, I should have recorded something there, but I didn't.
Well, sometimes these things happen.
Gotta live in the moment.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe we'll see. I might have still some footage left on the dash cam that I have in the car, so I might be able to grab that and post that on Twitter. So if you guys want that, let me know on Twitter, and I'll go rummaging for it and see if I can find it. Plus, also, I had a couple people I told this to, and they laughed pretty hard, but I accidentally walked 3 miles the other day.
Oh, no. Accidentally.
Yeah. Suffice to say, I got done doing a bunch. Yes. I got a bunch of work done, and then I went outside for a walk, and then I was like, I got more time. I'll walk a little further. And before I know, then you forget about the time it takes to walk back from where you came from, and then the walking back, and then I get home and I look down at my watch that's like tracking my walk, and I'm like, oh, I did 3 miles and I have a dance this evening. Well, this is going to be interesting.
Well, how did the dance go then?
I did not dance all the dances.
I believe it. Your feet were a little tired.
It worked out because then at the dance, the place we were going to have it at didn't end up being the place that we were supposed to. So we went back to the organizer's house, who has his upstairs all kitted out, but it's smaller than the venue.
Oh,
and it worked out nicely because there were just a lot of people. It was really great to have that many people there, but it meant that it was a little tight. And so I actually ended up, since I've been dancing long enough, helping the instructor out with different people that were like further on that didn't know what they were doing. So I didn't dance a lot, but I did a bit more of like assisting and instructing. So I wasn't my feet, but it wasn't like dancing type of exercise.
Right. That's good though. It's good to have people who know what they're doing, helping out those that don't. Right.
But in any case, that was my week going out. I also know, for those that are listening that were there Monday, I went to a Conservative of Idaho's event that a couple friends of mine invited me to over there at the Harvest Church. One of my good friends, Forrest, if you're listening, hey, Forrest, gave me a shout out there. So if there's any new people listening from there, hey, welcome. Hopefully you enjoy the show today. I know we have a bit of a fun one. The first story, I would say, is probably our main one that I put a lot of work into. More days than I want to mention on it. So hopefully it turns out well. Here's crossing our fingers.
Right. No, that's good though. It's good to put time into things like that.
Right. Well, with any further ado, we'll go into the stories here. So, as I alluded to, our first story here, Sandpoint and Herndon, guns and public places. Firearms and guns are among Idaho's favorite things, if you haven't discovered this yet, and you don't want to try to take them away from them, because we kind of love them a lot. So that being said, during the legislative session, Idaho Senator Scott Herndon from Sandpoint has put forward 2 bills. You know, he just wanted to double down. Senate Bill 1374 and Senate Bill 1310, which, if passed, aim to solve the legal and political debate that has been raging in the state of Idaho since 2019. Does Idaho's constitutional carry law, in the Idaho Constitution, apply to public places that have been leased to a private group or company? The Idaho Supreme Court says it does not, based on the current laws, but this new legislation aims to correct or overturn the position and establish a new one, which we're going to have to give a bit of background on this, specifically on this going on since 2019. So we'll do our best to do this in the most efficient way. But John, would you kind of fill us in on the first part of how this all started?
Definitely. So in 2019, according to the Idaho Supreme Court's factual background of the event that happened, on July 30, Sandpoint City executed a written lease agreement with the festival, which is an Idaho nonprofit corporation, to lease War Memorial Field to them for a duration of time, during which the festival put on a series of concerts at War Memorial Field. The field in question is owned by Sandpoint, which makes it public property. The festival was granted possession, use, and occupancy of all of War Memorial Field. At the end of the lease, The field reverted to the city. Senator Scott Herndon went to the festival, but when entering the event, he and his wife were told they couldn't bring their firearms into the festival. The senator argued that since War Memorial Field was a public place, according to the Idaho Constitution, he should be allowed to carry a gun there. Following this, the lead member of the festival security staff, Mr. Ogg, gave Mr. and Mrs. Herndon the option of securing their firearms in their vehicle and returning to the venue, or refunding their tickets, but explained that if the Herndons insisted on entering, they would be cited for trespassing. Herndon tried to continue the conversation with Ogg, but Ogg signaled for a police officer to come over. When the uniformed officer approached, Ogg told the officer that the Herndons were refusing to leave. Herndon clarified that he was not refusing to leave, but he wanted Ogg to explain the law that allowed the festival to prohibit firearms on the public property. The uniformed police officer explained to Herndon that as long as he was not past the gate, he was not the officer's problem. Herndon tried to engage further with the officer, but the officer walked away. In the end, the Herndons thanked Mr. Ogg and the attorney and left with Ogg to receive refunds for their tickets. So the only detail left out was the attorney for the city of Sandpoint happened to be standing outside the event, and the Herndons had a conversation with him about what the city would do if they went inside.
So after those events up there in Sandpoint, later on, Scott Herndon, Jeffrey Avery, the Idaho Second Amendment Alliance, Inc., and Second Amendment Foundation fought in court on the issue, saying that he and his wife should have been allowed to carry their firearms into the event. The court found, quote, nothing within the terms of the lease between the city and the festival addresses carrying firearms or restricts the rules that the festival may adopt while using the park for their private concert. Beyond that, both the Second Amendment and Article 1, Section 11 of the Idaho Constitution apply only to government actors, not private parties. Thus, the lease does not violate the public policy stated in the Idaho Code Section 18.3302J, Second Amendment, or the Idaho Constitution, Article 1, Section 11. Thus, the interpretation of Idaho's law related to the control of public property leased by a private entity was put to rest on this specific issue.
Yeah, so now coming to the present, Senator Herndon has put forward Senate Bills 1374 and 1310, which would change that ruling, or in some eyes close the loophole. Senate Bill 1374 was first read into the Senate on February 23 and then voted on March 11 with a vote of 28-7-0. It is now moving towards the House. SB 1310 has only been read once and has not been voted on. Both bills aim to amend Idaho's existing concealed weapons law. Currently, subsection 25 says, quote, nothing in subsection 3 or 4 of this section shall be construed to limit the existing rights of a private property owner, private tenant, private employer, or private business entity. But SB 1374 would add on to that and say, quote, the provisions of this sub 4 section shall not apply to any property owned by the state of Idaho or its political subdivisions that is normally and habitually open to the public. Such limitation on the application of this subsection shall supersede 7 Herndon versus City of Sandpoint, 531 P3D 1125, Idaho 2023. And then Senate Bill 1310 would also add a new subsection, subsection 26, quote, unless otherwise prohibited in this chapter, nothing in this section shall be construed to limit the right to keep and bear arms on any property owned by the state of Idaho or its political subdivisions that is leased, rented, licensed, loaned, permitted, or occupied, whether for consideration or not, to any private entity or person if such private entity or person exclusively and continuously possesses and enjoys the use of such property for an event that would appear to a reasonable person to be open to the general public with free, unrestricted access. Nothing in this subsection relieves any political subdivision of the state of Idaho of its duties to convey or manage public property in accordance with Idaho law, end quote. So, in summary, the first bill, 1374, would supersede the Idaho Supreme Court ruling. It would clarify the law to say that subsection 25 only applies to private property and not public or public land leased to a private entity. Likewise, the second bill, 1310, would expand on that idea and make it even clearer.
So yeah, going into our application here, breaking down all that, I know it can be a little bit wordy. We want to make sure there's no confusion that the state of Idaho cannot prohibit people from carrying firearms in public places, such as parks or publicly funded or accessible places. The part that is trying to be considered is when it comes that there's a public place, for example, with Mr. Herndon up north, that it's public and then the city leases it to a private entity. Because current state law says that if you're a private entity, you get to say what to do with that land. But then, wait a second, I just leased this property that was public now to someone who's private. So does that mean now the property becomes private, or is it still public? And so that's where a lot of this confusion has come in. One side argues that once the land is leased, the owners of the lease dictate the rules of what happens on the land during the lease, independent of the state of the property beforehand. The other side argues that since the city never had the authority to restrict guns on the property in the first place, the private group or entity also does not have the authority because the city/state does not have the authority to give them that because of the nature of the land. So the Idaho Supreme Court ruled that law currently stands for lack of a case, so they kind of added more precedent. But these bills are trying to say, hey, we're not trying to reinvent, in a sense, the law, but we're saying, hey, that was the interpretation of the law based on what's currently written. So let's clarify that so that more correctly, in a representative republic, that we're going to try to go into the bill and close that loophole or that wrong interpretation. So I guess that brings us into our main 2 points that I wanted to point out. The first one is the way that governance is supposed to be done. I think some people listening to this story, because Herndon was the person that had the issue, then Herndon went to the court, and then he's going and he's writing this legislation and stuff that, like, this is bad. We shouldn't let our elected representatives be this way and be vindictive about things. And I could see the person having that angle about this topic. But respectfully, I would say Mr. Herndon's coming from actually a really respectful in the way that we should handle these legal things when it comes into our country.
Yeah, I would say that what happened here makes total sense to me. He went through the process as he was supposed to. A lot of people will say that when you're dealing with an issue in person, especially when it comes to dealing with cops and security, you don't argue with the cop that's there. They don't care about your argument, which you can say that's a problem, because if a cop doesn't know the law and he's enforcing a law illegally, that's not good. That cop should be punished. He should be reprimanded. But the way this happened makes sense. There was an issue. He went through the process in ways that made sense. Then he appealed to his local legislator, which just so happens to be him, then went through the process of getting legislation created. It just happens that he is the person it happened to, and he's also the local legislator that he appealed to. So we have checks and balances for people doing things. This seems simple to me, the way it's supposed to.
And when I went out and found, and it'll be in the description so you can look for it for yourself as well, the court documents of that factual background that they had leading into it. That's what I've used basically to give the statement of these facts. So it's not he said, she said. No, this is what the Idaho Supreme Court is saying were the factual, provable, witnessable events that they were working off of. So I decided to work off that. And from that, they made it very clear throughout it that Mr. Herndon did not escalate, that he was respectful. As for the court part of it and the 300-foot view looking down on it, he had an issue with the law. Then he went and said, hey, I think that's wrong. I'm going to challenge it, because the court system is the one that sits there and applies the law and says either is it applied wrongly, is it interpreted wrongly, right? So that's the first thing you do. If you feel like there's an error in the way of a law is being applied, it's the court system. So we went there. Mm-hmm. The court told him, no, the law is being applied correctly. He said, okay, fine. If that's the law of the land, we need to change the law of the land because I disagree with that. And so he went as a legislature, or you can do this with your legislature, is go to them and be like, no, here, this is the type of bill it should be. Because it's a really cool thing. If you have a bill or an idea for legislation, you can go to your legislature and be like, hey, we should write something with this. And they're willing to co-sponsor it for you. Or even another senator that's not in your district. If you can find one senator, someone who's willing to help you with that and the writing of it and get the clerks on board and stuff, you can totally do that. But in his case, he's already in the driver's seat.
Yeah, my wife was actually going through the process of that she was talking to our local, I think it was our local House.
So that'd be representative.
Talking to him. Yeah, talking to him about that process and what it would look like. And it was really interesting. He gave her a really fascinating rundown of how that process worked. He said, we have people that can write laws, that can take laws that have been passed by other state houses, and we can work with those. Also, he's like, I'm not the person that should be introducing this bill because I'm a part of the minority team, so you should go with this person, and then I can co-sponsor it. And it was just fascinating. And it doesn't require that much.
Not in Idaho.
To do,
and it's such a blessing.
Yeah.
All that said, for those, I wanted to dispel that. I think this is a great way to work in government. I don't think he's being vindictive. There's nothing to show that here. And this, I think, would be a good example of how, if you have an issue with a law, of how to handle that situation if you run into something in your own life. Now, the second point I wanted to make with this, out of all this, is the government can't give authority it doesn't have. From a Christian point of view, ultimately, all authority comes from God. And if, you don't believe about the Judeo-Christian God, we can go with a higher power. All right? We'll go with that. But if this higher power has ultimate authority because he created all things, just like the guy who built the car, he has all authority on how the car should work and treat, because he built it, he made it. And thus, any authority that we have is granted to us from God. So any authority that we see on earth, it's this stewardship. It's being handed down the chain in kind of stewardship, in a sense, that you're being honored with that. That being said, the best way I give this example, because I know it can be a little hard, maybe for if there's a younger viewer out there, I really want you to understand this, that if, say, I have A, B, and C authority, but I don't have D authority, then I can't give someone that's below me D authority. I don't have it. It's like sitting there and saying, I have chocolate chip cookies, I have chocolate cake, but I don't have snickerdoodles. Well, I can't give snickerdoodles to my sister because I don't have snickerdoodles. I don't. Right. I can't give what I don't have authority or I don't have in my possession. And I think that's an example here with this law, is that it's clarifying it, because I think it was a little bit ambiguous for the Supreme Court, and they went with the direction they felt was in accordance with other case law. But clarifying that to be like, no, just because a private entity is now leasing public property, the city can't then give that private entity authority to that property that property doesn't already have.
Right. Which to me makes sense.
But anywho, that is, I think, I don't know, I can't see the full time, but I think us and John summarized from 2019 to the present with bill and legislation in like 10 minutes. So hopefully that gives you a good overview. And if you like this bill, then write your representative over in the House that it will move through. And if you don't like it, then likewise, please, it's a representative government we have here, and do write them as well. Be involved. That is the number one thing we try to encourage here at Local Yokel. Now, speaking of something that a lot of people have been involved in the process with this, including your wife there, it sounds like, John. House Bill 710, Idaho's latest attempt to remove harmful library materials. So, for those who have listened to the show or are involved in Idaho politics, you might remember House Bill 314, put forward by Jaron Crane, which aimed to amend existing law to prohibit certain materials from being promoted, given, or made available to minors by a school or public library. It barely passed the Idaho House and easily passed the Senate, but it ended up getting vetoed by Governor Little, which they tried to get back together to overturn that veto, but they couldn't get the proper majority. They were like 1 to 2 votes short, which is frustrating. The main concern that he cited concerning the bill was related to how it was ambiguous or could lead to unintended consequences for libraries and their patrons, and could increase the cost for local libraries due to fines. Well, this session, Representative Jaron Crane's new bill aims to take another shot at getting the legislation passed related to explicit material in public/school libraries. After several failed bills that have attempted to regulate and set down rules for what public libraries can and cannot display to minors, the hope is that House Bill 710 will be able to achieve the goals that its proponents want, setting a moral rule for what is allowed to be shown, and solving the concerns that the governor and others have had about the overreach on free speech, and stressing libraries about untold dues and other things. Which, before we get into this, we need to compare the two bills to learn from those mistakes, because you don't try to do the same thing twice, because it usually doesn't go well. If you didn't get through the wall the first time in the way you did, you should probably think about it a different way. So let's kind of look here first at the differences, and if you could point those out for us, John.
Yeah, so first off, both bills aim to amend Section 18-1514 of the Idaho Code to define terms related to obscene materials and harmful content for minors. The definitions provided in both bills are terms such as minor, nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, and others. They're largely similar, aiming to establish a legal framework for identifying material that are not suitable for minors. And second, they both have in common that they use what is called the Miller test, a pronged test that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled determines whether a speech or expression can be labeled as obscene and thus not protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So here's the layout of the three steps. Whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work, taken as a whole, appeals to the prurient interests. This prong assesses whether the material in question has a tendency to excite lustful thoughts or sexual desires in the average person, judged by current societal norms. The second one is whether the work depicts or describes, in a patently offensive way, sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law. So that part of the test examines whether the material portrays sexual activities or bodily functions in a manner that is blatantly offensive to the established standards of decency in the community. And then the third part of that is whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literacy, artistic, political, or scientific value. This final prong evaluates the material's value beyond mere titillation or offense, considering whether it contributes meaningfully to the discourse in any significant area of human endeavor. So House Bill 314, it allowed any minor who obtains material or a parent or legal guardian whose child obtained material in violation of the act to have a cause of action against the institution, the school or public library, if employees or agents of the institution gave or made available material harmful to minors. It allowed for the recovery of $2,500 in statutory damages, as well as actual damages and any other relief available by law, including injunctive relief. But now House Bill 710, so this also provides a cause of action, but it introduces a requirement for written notice to the school or public library asking for the relocation of such material to a section designed for adults only within 30 days of receipt of the written notice. If the institution fails to relocate the material after this period, then a cause of action can be brought. However, the statutory damages recoverable under HB 710 are reduced to $250. Furthermore, 710 introduces a new provision not found in 314, requiring each school and public library to have a readily accessible form allowing a person to request a review of material the person considers to be harmful to minors. The form must contain the definition of harmful to minors as provided in Section 18-1514 of the Idaho Code. This addition suggests an attempt to formalize the process for challenging materials before legal action can be taken.
Right. So not going too deep into the weeds, but I do want to quickly recap for those that haven't heard me and John's position on this. It's a topic that in Idaho politics has been talked to death as much as it is an important topic. Do not get me wrong. It is important. And I'm really glad that Mr. Crane is staying on it. But giving a quick recap for those that haven't, the first prong that kind of sits on this that me and John agree on is an objective right and wrong. If we agree that there's a right and wrong, we should be able to agree that there is information, images, or material that are right and those that are then wrong. Because if we believe there are objective standards, we should be able to divide between which is which. Now, are we always going to get that right? No. We believe that we're flawed human beings. We don't live in a perfect world. But in the pursuit, we should still try to pursue to remove that which is wrong and keep that which is right. And so we can at least, at the bare minimum, on these issues that are harder maybe to define, I give harder with air quotations, that it shouldn't be exposed to minors. That it's one thing for an adult, it's another thing for a minor that's developing. They don't have a full perspective of the world that they're looking at. They haven't quite developed or solidified the position they want to come from. And thus, there should be extra protections. And also with minors, they don't have the exact same representation that an adult gets in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Because they're a minor. They are underneath their parents' authority and stewardship. And that's kind of where the crux of this is coming in. Certain people think that transgender content, we'll put it that way, should be available to consume, and to restrict it is a restriction of free speech.
It's not just transgender. There's a lot of different content that gets talked about. There was actually, I think it was a 60 Minutes report that came out where they interviewed some ladies who were a part of a group trying to stop these materials. And if you haven't watched that, it was a really interesting segment. But the more interesting thing was the gaslighting that went on around it. It was like a 2-hour interview, and 60 Minutes aired like 5 minutes of it, or maybe 10 or 15 minutes of it.
I hate that.
And right. Well, and they edited it in such a way to make these ladies seem crazy. And they did it very effectively in the 60-minute interview. They seemed crazy, but you look at the transcript, because the gals recorded the whole thing and then provided that transcript, and they went to Twitter with it. And yeah, they had some solid points. A lot of what we're talking about here, like, do you want your children reading and looking at pornography when they're 6 to 12? And a lot of us would say, no, my children don't need to be dealing with that at that age. That's not even that doesn't need to be a part of their thought process. So not just trans stuff, although that is a part of the whole thing, but there's a whole deviant nature that is being, pushed right now by society.
Yeah, we should write laws that promote good and write laws that prevent bad. That's an issue that the libertarians have in that corner, but that we won't step too much into that.
That promote good and punish evil.
Right. Which, even if you live on that camp where you're wanting the most limited government, we should at least have that laws that try to keep the cohesiveness of society. That if we believe that human beings aren't inherently good, that we're evil and we're sinful and we make errors, and as the scripture would say, we're desperately wicked above all things, we need laws to help restrain that and to keep order so that you can even have commerce and be fluent in society. This is just another area of saying, hey, no, that doesn't need to be there for minors. And also, the other prong I wanted to give on this is this: we've talked about in the past about taxpayer dollars. If the taxpayer says, I don't want my money going to that, the taxpayer perfectly has that right. There are strings attached to that money because it is public money, and those strings are the wishes of the taxpayer base. So if the taxpayer base is voting people in, like Jaron Crane and other people that are voting for this position, and it gets passed, this isn't a threat to democracy, as some people might cry in that sense. But I would argue also, to clarify there, the point I'm giving, my second point, is superseded by the first one, that what is objectively right and wrong does go above public opinion or the will of the people. Yeah. We're not sitting here and saying that if everyone says it's right, then do it. Because if we say that, we get into a really dangerous place, which I won't name that part of history because it's named too often. That's in the 20th century. But we are saying it is this hierarchy. Number one, it has to be objective right and wrong, and that the people then have a will upon that objective right and wrong of where their funds do or don't want to go in the society they want to live in. Now, with all that out of the way, is this an improvement or not based on the other one? The original was that the fear that it would create a bounty system, which would strain the school and library system. That's what the governor gave. That's what the people against it were kind of giving, on top of the free speech concerns and stuff, which I would argue part of the goal was to put a strain, because it's not hard to just not show explicit materials at libraries. So part of that being a bounty system, that point of it, I'm sorry, I try on the show, and anybody that's listened enough time will know, I try vehemently to try to see the logic on the other side, and I don't see it on that count. You're basically telling me to your face, hey, I don't want you to penalize the thing you want to penalize. Well, we have an issue now. The whole reason of the bill was to say, don't do that, and I'm going to charge you if you do that.
Right. I mean, I guess it makes sense in a certain sense to say we don't want people bringing frivolous lawsuits. And so this would be another instance of, we don't want people bringing books where they're not, where it's not clear that they do meet those requirements. And then you constantly start that process, and now you have a backlog and people have to be dealing with this all the time, and it's just getting frustrating over and over again, and yada, yada, yada. And so I can understand the desire to streamline the process a little bit and say, look, that we don't want to make our schools librarians' lives that much more difficult than they need to be, because we're incentivizing people to take whatever material they can and present it as being wrong and bad and needed to be covered by this law. So I can understand why someone would say that. It makes a certain amount of sense to me.
I mean, the one counter I have to that, personally, from my conviction anyways, is that Go read it, please. Oftentimes people get daunted by looking at bills, but especially when they're amending stuff, you can glance and it'll actually highlight all the areas where they added changes. So if you really want to, you can read the whole thing, but you don't have to. You can scroll to the point there where you're seeing the amendments and changes and read from there. That said, this bill goes on for like a page or two of describing and specifying what is considered harmful.
Yeah.
And like we talked about earlier, that 3-prong test.
Is that Miller
test that the Supreme Court said determined what it labels an expression was seen or not. That's also a part of it, a component of it that's being used. So to that person that's worried about too many lawsuits, too many issues coming against the library, I feel like with that level of definitions, a lot of stuff would be easily and very quickly be able to be thrown out of court.
Right, because it doesn't meet those requirements. Well, that's where you get the whole narrative driving legality, where the supposed don't say gay bill in Florida. Well, the bill never said anything. Those words never showed up anywhere in the bill, but that's what it was labeled as. Looking at the storyline that this bill has taken to get to the point that it's at, I can understand why people are nervous about it and don't want it to happen, but I don't think they understand what the bill is or what it would do.
Right.
And if you truly understand what the bill is and what it would do, then I question your motives when you start saying that you don't actually want this bill. Because I think at that point you're saying that you want children to have their hands on sexually explicit materials from a very young age. And
right. And I mean, on this issue that me and John are talking about, I will say, I think the added wait period thing where it says, hey, they let the library know, please remove that. It gives the library a certain time frame to comply. And it's also a way to settle it before it becomes legal, that there's a proceeding laid out before the court. Now, if the library wants to pick a fight, for lack of a better word, and doesn't remove it or doesn't move it to an adult section or whatever thing you want to call it, right, that's on the library deciding it wants to get into hot water. And also, something I didn't have in my notes, but I realized it as I was recording this. If any of you have ever been down to the Boise Public Library that's in like downtown Boise, there's multiple levels. You've got like the kids section that's off to the left. Mm-hmm. And then when you go in, you've got kind of the movie area. And then you can go up another staircase and there's an entire level for nonfiction. But most people don't actually go up to the third level. The third level, there's a bunch of wooden cases up there. As you can guess, I've been up there for certain things, but you actually have to be accompanied by a librarian, and you have to be 18, if I remember correctly, because there's different legal documents and stuff that you're seeing up there, and they want to make sure that they're kept in good care. The age part, I can't quite remember, but the point I want to give on this is I do remember you did have to have a librarian give you access and take you up there to those things, unless you're in like, there's like a common area that once they get that material for you, you can read without being supervised, which for all those people who are saying that this is going to cost so much for librarians to have a separate section. You already do this, or just don't have explicit material. Right.
It's literally already not an issue.
Anywho, that's an update for you guys out there. That bill is a chugging forward. It has passed through the Idaho House, because it's a House bill. It passed with a 47 in favor and 23 against. So there again, scrape by. Wasn't quite as bad as the original one. It was a little bit of a tighter scrape last time. So this time it actually got through a little bit more easily. So that's encouraging to hear. And we'll see how the Senate moves on it. The key part is if it will be satisfactory for the governor and if he'll try to veto it again or not, because I have a feeling this is going to pass the Senate, because last time it passed the Senate pretty easily. It was the House that was the hookup. But if he vetoes it, then the question will be, can the House and Senate get enough of a majority to override, assuming the governor isn't happy enough with the changes?
Yeah, well, and then that starts bringing into question our governor and the fact that he's vetoing bills multiple years in a row that our legislators are passing.
So, any case, we'll move out of politics and on to our next one. Which, hey, little speed bump on our way over to that next story. If you made it this far, you probably enjoy the show, and that probably means you love keeping up with things that are in Idaho. So don't forget to hit the subscribe button or follow button on YouTube, Rumble, or Twitter. That way you don't miss any of our future content about Idaho. Not to mention, if you found our content valuable and think it might benefit others, please like and share it. We have short clips from the show on our YouTube, Rumble, and Twitter accounts, which are perfect for sharing parts of the show that you found important or valuable with friends and family. Whether it's a fascinating political update or an intriguing local story, your shares and likes can help us spread the word about our beautiful state. Also, for our audio-only listeners on platforms like iTunes or Spotify, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please rate the show and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us out a ton to improve the channel as a whole. With that said, thank you for the support and for being part of the local yokel Idaho community. Together, hopefully, we can keep Idaho informed and engaged and involved in this wonderful state. With that said, now let's dive into the next story. As I teased earlier, Treasure Valley spring outdoor activities for those of us in the Treasure Valley in the southern part of the state. This last week gave us a very playful taste of spring and summer to come. Hopefully it doesn't pull the rug out from underneath us because, welcome to Idaho. Which I know for myself got me thinking about getting out and enjoying it. And so I wanted to make this last story one to share some activities that you guys could do outside in the wonderful weather, plus some that actually are best done in the spring. A lot of people think, oh, it's spring, it's not time. But no, really, there's some activities that are really best done in the spring rather than the summer when it gets a little bit more toasty. So with that said, I made a list here for you guys, and I will chuck it over to John to start off with our first one that's over in the Boise area.
Yeah, so if you're in the Boise area, like Tyler said, something that's really close to you is the MK Nature Center. It's located right by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game headquarters. That's downtown, yeah?
Close to it. It sits there along the Greenbelt. It's not like in downtown, but
but it's just a little bit further. I just opened up the map and looked at it. No, that's cool. So I know my wife and kids have gone to that several times, and they always come back really
super
talking
fun.
about. Yeah, they've talked about how great it is. So it has walking paths. There's a pond stocked with lots of fish that you can see from the paths above the pond, which is awesome. It's fun to watch fish do.
They've got like a huge sturgeon in there too. That's really cool. I know the more male members of the family will love, look at that. I want to catch that. How do I get down there? You're like, no.
Right. I know there are several places in the city that you can do some fishing. So that would be another thing that could be added to this list.
I think Park Center Park can do that. That's over on that end of town as well. And then there's a pond that's right off of Eagle Road. I can't remember the crossroad there, but there's a park when you're traveling on Eagle Road North.
I think the one you might be thinking the McDevitt Fields or the McDevitt Sports Complex there at Eagle and McMillan.
Yeah, it sounds about right.
Yeah, that one is a really cool one. It's kind of a smaller pond, but It is pretty awesome. Bridging off of that, there's also a little skate park at the McDevitt Sports Complex.
Okay.
There are several skate parks throughout the city that are quite awesome if your kids are into that. But what's an even better family activity I've found, and we've done this with our kids a couple times, there's the Boise Bike Park. There's Fort Boise Park.
Okay.
Kind of up by
almost up by Camel's Back or the old penitentiary.
It's towards the old penitentiary.
Okay.
If you go up Broadway and just keep going up and then take a right when it goes on its little roundabout, then the Boise Bike Park is right there.
Okay. Which, I mean, that topic of bikes, there's also the Greenbelt. That's another great resource that connects to a ton of stuff in the valley. So, if you're sitting there and worried that your kid's still learning how to bike and you don't want to take them to a park or something, the Greenbelt's also a really good option.
Yeah, or just bike and cover distance, then that could also be a fun thing. It's a way to change things up. And speaking of bike parks, I know there are several. There's one up in Eagle, I believe, and one in Meridian somewhere.
Yeah.
So another one, and I don't remember if you mentioned this earlier, but if you're further on the west end of the valley, there's the Rotary Pond Park. It's located off of Centennial Way in Caldwell. It's got a paved path that goes around the pond. And if you have your fishing license, then you can also go fishing with your family. So
this is one of those that's good to do in the spring, wink, wink, mainly because come fall and summer, there will be more mosquitoes. They like to be out in full force there, but there's like a really big field next to it. So if the kids want to do like soccer or something, they can do that, or football. But then if you want to go walk on this path, it goes around the lake. And there's even a couple docks if you want to put a canoe out on it.
Top of the pond, there's the archery range. There's also a shotgun club out that direction. So some cool stuff in that area.
Oh yeah. It's a really cool place to go, and they've kept it rather rural.
Nice. The pictures, the ponds are green, so hopefully they're not when you're there.
Yeah, there again, as I said, go in spring. This is one of those I recommend spring, not late summer to fall. Also on the pond kind of train of thought and the western end of the valley, there's Wilson Springs Pond, which is similar to the MK Nature Center. It's located there in Nampa when you go like a little further south and east of Lake Lowell. They've got some nice paths to walk around. The main difference, if you're trying to choose between Rotary or the Wilson Springs, is the Rotary one has a lot more big, mature, deciduous trees, and there's going to be a lot more shade. But the Wilson one, it's not paved, but the gravel is a lot smoother in a sense there. There isn't quite as much shade, but it's more about the water feature. There's pond/river system that goes through there, so you can see ducks and geese, and they might even have some swans in there. I can't remember. So that also is a really great option if you're in the Nampa area to just take walks. I've always enjoyed, especially going there in dusk. I think they have a couple owls that live out there as well. So that could be kind of a fun field trip to do with the kids.
Yeah, that could be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So those are like ponds and, I don't know, more leisurely things. If you're wanting to get into more hiking type stuff, there are any number of places that are really close as you get up into the foothills. Camel's Back Park is a fun one. There's a main path that goes up, and then there's a bunch of paths that branch out and around, and it's a lot of fun. There's also a big playground there. I will say that's a place that gets pretty darn jam-packed on the weekends.
Yep.
So if you're not a fan of crowds, then Camel's Back Park probably isn't your place to go, but it is a cool place to go and see.
It's a good place to practice if you're trying to get ready for the hiking season that you've been
That's true.
all winter. It's a good place because there's a lot of different level of hiking trails. There's the really easy ones where there again you can take a stroller on it. But if you want to go for it, there's also a lot of trails there at Camel's Back that you can definitely work up a sweat, build some exercise, but you don't have to drive too far from the Boise metropolitan. You can practically almost bike if you live anywhere in Boise to it.
Yeah. Which is pretty cool. It's a pretty cool place.
And then Table Rock is another one that we alluded to. It's over there by the old penitentiary. People know where that is. You can search that. That's a really enjoyable hike to do. When you get up there in Table Rock where they have the cross and stuff, you can see the whole Treasure Valley almost. You can see Boise at least. But I wanted to add it in this list specifically because if you go in the middle of summer, it will be very, very hot. And there's barely any shade on the trail. So the best times to usually go is in the spring because there's a bunch of wildflowers that are usually blooming up there. It's green, it's lush. You don't have a lot of the prickly stuff that'll get in your socks.
Yeah, no, we did that one, I think, a couple of years ago now, and it was a lot of fun. It was fun getting up there. And at this point, the kids see the cross, and they'll point to it and be like, "Oh, the cross, we were up there. We know that place. Wow." So those moments are always fun as a parent to be able to remind your children of those experiences that they've had.
Right.
So, yeah, no, Table Rock's definitely a good one. The next on the list that you've got here is Jump Creek. And this is one that I know you've talked about quite a bit. I've not gotten out there yet. I need to.
Yeah, it for people that are feeling left out in the western part of the valley, because Boise shunts right up there to the mountains. There is still a lot of cool stuff you can do out to the west. The main premier one of the western part of the valley would be Jump Creek. There's a really easy 15 to 18 minute hike that just goes straight through the canyon to the falls there. And this is one also, I would say it's good all year long. The only time I would say it's not is the middle of winter because it can get windy out there because there's no timber on the top parts. And so you can kind of get frozen out, especially even there in the canyon. But early spring, it's pretty to go. You can hike in there. All the trees in the canyon will be blooming and stuff. And you can see the beautiful rock because the rain usually keeps it cleaner. And so those beautiful colors off the rock are a lot brighter. But if you are someone who wants a little bit more challenging, you can hike above the falls and go back and then come behind them and come in that way, which is a little bit more arduous.
Okay.
It can take an hour plus sometimes. I actually have not fully completed that trek yet just because of time commitment. But yeah, likewise on that side of town, for those who want to just go all out. The best place overall for the valley I would recommend is over by the Owyhee Mountains, mainly because of the fact that there's a lot of really great hiking trails. The rocks are really pretty there again, similar with Jump Creek, because Jump Creek's in that same direction of where the Owyhee Mountain Range is. But going out there in the spring is probably the best time because, one, there's not a lot of shade, so you want it to be cooler when you're out there so you don't fry on the rocks. And then number two, some of the views, because there isn't any trees, are so long and wide. When you have that fresh green spring grass, you can see the wind coming up some of the valleys and gullies up towards you with the mountain as the wind's moving the grasses. And so it's a really cool place to go over in the early spring. But anywho, there's tons of cool things you can do any part of the state, any time of year. But if you're wanting to find more resources about this, specifically the trails over in the Waihees or by Bogus, there's an app that I found that's been really great called All. The best way I'd have to describe it is it's like the Google Maps for trails. There's a paid and there's a free version. So the free version, you can open it up on your browser, you can download the app and stuff. But with both of those, it will require internet. So you can print off a map of the trail before you go. But with the paid app, you're actually able to download the map onto your phone or digital device, and it'll actually use the GPS to show you as you're going along the trail, and you can map your altitude and different stuff. So for the paid thing, you get a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more integration to have all that. But if you just want to discover new trails and you're willing to print out the map before you go and you have the location put into your GPS or your TomTom or whatever you want to use to get there, that's a really, really great resource to discover stuff.
Cool.
All that said, some really cool things you can go do. I probably will be doing some of these, so you might see some of those posts come out on the Twitter as those occur and happen. But that is our show for this week. Thank you for listening to the entire podcast. I sincerely hope you found it enjoyable and valuable. If we missed any important points or provided incorrect information, please feel free to reach out to me via email at localyocalidaho2022@gmail.com or on Twitter by tweeting me at localyocalidaho. With the small team we have, we're not able to cover everything, but we do our best to cover the most interesting and important stories. Thank you for your continued support and assistance. That's all for now, and I wish you a fantastic rest of your week. Godspeed.